Hey everyone, my name is Tim, and I'm here to tell you about the most horrifying experience of my life. It happened not too long ago on a chilly October night during a bus trip I took from Boston to New York along Route 6. This wasn't just any bus ride, it turned into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. It was October 15th, 2023, a Sunday. The weather was crisp and cold, the kind that makes you pull your jacket tighter around you. My bus, number 7321, was scheduled to depart at 10:00 p.m. from the Boston South Station. I was excited about the trip because I had an important meeting the next day in New York, and I wanted to get there early to explore the city a bit. When I arrived at the station around 9:30 p.m., everything seemed normal. The station was bustling with people, travelers, commuters, and a few homeless folks huddled in corners trying to stay warm. The bus itself was an older model, but it looked reliable enough. As I boarded the bus, I noticed a few other passengers already settled in. There was Karen, a middle-aged woman with curly hair and glasses, who sat in the front row reading a book. Next to her was Mike, a college student with headphones on, lost in his music. Further back was Mr. Johnson, a retired man who looked like he'd seen it all. He had a calm demeanor, almost as if nothing could surprise him anymore. In the seat across from me was Emily, a young professional like myself, busy typing away on her laptop. The bus driver, a grizzled man named Frank, greeted each of us with a nod. He had an air of experience and confidence, which was somewhat reassuring. We departed right on time. The city lights faded into the distance as we hit the highway. The bus was quiet, except for the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of pages as Karen turned them. I settled into my seat, plugged in my headphones, and tried to relax. About an hour into the journey, things started to get eerie. The first sign was the fog. It rolled in thick and fast, enveloping the bus in a dense, impenetrable white blanket. Frank slowed down, his silhouette visible in the rearview mirror as he leaned forward, squinting at the road. Around 11:30 p.m., as we were driving through a particularly remote stretch of the highway, the bus suddenly jerked to a halt. Everyone was thrown forward in their seats. Mike's headphones flew off, and Emily's laptop almost slid to the floor. Frank cursed under his breath and got up to investigate. "Everyone stay in your seats," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of tension. He stepped off the bus and disappeared into the fog. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. The silence was palpable, and the tension in the air grew thicker with each passing second. Finally, Frank reappeared, looking pale. "There's nothing out there," he said, shaking his head. "Must have been an animal or something. Let's keep moving." We continued on, but the atmosphere had changed. The fog was thicker, and the bus seemed colder. I wrapped my jacket tighter around me and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. Then, around midnight, I noticed something strange. There was a new passenger on the bus. He was sitting at the very back, dressed in an old-fashioned suit and hat, his face obscured by the shadows. I nudged Emily. "Did you see that guy get on the bus?" She glanced back, her eyes widening. "No, I didn't. That's weird. I thought we were the only ones." We both exchanged uneasy glances but decided not to make a fuss. Maybe he had been there all along and we just hadn't noticed. As we drove on, the air grew colder and the fog seemed to press against the windows as if trying to get inside. Then the lights inside the bus started to flicker. Karen's book fell from her hands and she let out a small gasp. "What's going on?" Mr. Johnson muttered, looking around. Suddenly, the bus lurched again, and this time it didn't stop. We were speeding down the highway, faster and faster. Frank was gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "I can't stop it," he shouted. "The brakes aren't working." Panic set in. Mike tried to call for help, but there was no signal. Emily clutched her laptop, her eyes wide with fear. Mr. Johnson was praying quietly. Then the new passenger stood up. His face was still hidden, but his presence was overwhelming. He walked slowly down the aisle, and as he passed, the lights flickered more violently. "What do you want?" Karen cried, her voice trembling. The man stopped and turned towards her. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and when he spoke, his voice was cold and hollow. "You're all mine," he said. Frank was struggling to control the bus, but it was no use. We were hurtling down the highway at breakneck speed. The ghostly passenger continued his slow march down the aisle, and as he did, the temperature dropped even further. "Everyone, hold on!" Frank yelled, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of the wind howling outside and the bus engine roaring. Mike was the first to act. He grabbed his backpack and threw it at the ghostly figure, but it passed right through him, landing with a thud on the floor. "Run!" Emily screamed, but there was nowhere to go. We were trapped on the speeding bus with no escape. The ghostly passenger reached out a hand towards Karen, and she screamed as an icy chill enveloped her. "No, stay away," she cried, but it was no use. Her screams echoed through the bus as she was lifted off her seat and thrown against the window. Frank was fighting with the steering wheel, trying to regain control. "Hang on, everyone. We're almost there." But we didn't know where there was. The fog outside was so thick we couldn't see anything. The ghostly passenger continued his march, reaching out to each of us in turn. Mike was next. He tried to fight back, but his punches went right through the figure. "Leave us alone!" Emily shouted, but her voice was weak, trembling with fear. Finally, the ghostly passenger reached me. I felt an icy hand close around my throat and I couldn't breathe. "You will never leave," he whispered, his breath cold against my skin. Just when I thought it was all over, the bus screeched to a halt. We were thrown forward again, and the ghostly figure vanished. We were in the middle of nowhere, the fog slowly lifting to reveal an old, abandoned gas station. Frank was panting, his hands still gripping the steering wheel. "Everyone okay?" he asked, his voice shaking. We nodded, still in shock. Karen was clutching her arm, bruised but alive. Mike was shaking, his face pale. Emily was crying, but she was unhurt. Mr. Johnson was still praying, his voice a whisper. "What was that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Frank shook his head. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here." We stumbled off the bus, the cold night air a welcome change from the freezing temperature inside. As we stood there trying to catch our breath, the bus suddenly burst into flames. We watched in horror as the old vehicle was consumed by fire, the flames licking at the sky. "What just happened?" Karen whispered, her voice barely audible. No one had an answer. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere, our phones still without signal, with no idea how to get help. It took hours, but finally, a passing truck driver saw the flames and stopped to help us. He called for help, and soon we were being taken to the nearest town. When we told the police what had happened, they looked at us like we were crazy. "An old passenger," one of them said, shaking his head. "That bus has been off the road for years." "But we saw him," Emily insisted. "He was there." They didn't believe us. We were taken to a hospital and treated for shock, but no one could explain what had happened. The bus was a charred wreck, nothing left but ashes. It wasn't until days later that we found out the truth. An old newspaper article from 1953 told the story of a bus crash on that very stretch of highway. The driver had lost control in the fog, and everyone on board had died. The ghost of the driver was said to haunt the road looking for souls to join him. We had been his latest victims, but somehow we had survived. To this day, I can't explain what happened. All I know is that I will never forget that night, and I will never set foot on a bus again. The memory of that ghostly passenger still haunts me, and I can still hear his cold, hollow voice in my nightmares. So, if you ever find yourself on a lonely road in the middle of the night and the fog starts to roll in, be careful. You never know who or what might be out there waiting for you.